All right, welcome everybody. Happy Thursday. Today we have Randy Barber here. And for anybody in the SBA Path to Success group, we recently started reading the Brene Brown book, which I know, Randy, you're a huge fan of her. So we're reading Dare to Lead. Mhm. So one of the things, she had so many nuggets, but one of the things that stuck out to me was where she was talking about studying leadership is way easier than actually leading. That just stuck with me, kind of like Tony Robbins says, it's not about what you know, it's what you do consistently. So that's why we're super excited to have Randy here today to talk about training yourself to think and lead in a new and different way, which is essential given how much the workplace has changed since 2020 and is forever changed. So today is all about leading at your best, so your team's at their best. It's not about exercising authority, it's about how you behave and your mindset, your habits, productivity, how you show up and how you do that consistently, and the way that it influences others to show up, for them to be brave and bold, which Randy knows all about. He spent 35 years managing and leading companies in the engineering and construction industry. At one point, you told me you were an aerobics instructor, I believe.
That's correct.
Which I would have never believed.
A few days ago, that's right. It's a few days ago.
Yeah, that was a fascinating nugget there. And so then about 6 years ago, he started his own LLC for a consulting company where he helps people be their best. So he is here today to help us be our best. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to you, Randy. Okay.
Cool. Well, thanks. And as Brittany said, so much of what we do is really related to how we think, and mindset has such an important aspect on leadership and in general how we show up in relationships. And if you think about what's your mindset when you prepare to go to work? And some days it's like this. You'd say, I have all my ducks in a row, and today's just going to be absolutely swimming. But then there are other days where you look at it and go, today is just going to be a train wreck. And if you think about how much your mindset as you prepare for work affects how your outcome goes, I think what you'll find that there's a significant relationship between those two. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that if you think that every day is going to be unicorns and rainbows, it's going to be better than the day before. That would just be stupid. And face it, some days are just flat out train wrecks. Yet what your mindset is when you show up for work has a significant aspect, not only on you, but on the others that you lead. And you've probably heard of studies that say that most of our communication is nonverbal. It's related to body language, facial expressions, and tone of voice. And they have a much higher influence than the words you actually use. And what your mindset is like when you show up has a significant impact and a significant influence on your body language and your nonverbal communication. And as it's related to mindset, that's related to three things that are within your control: how you think, how you feel, and how you behave. And as leaders, you make a splash every day. And that splash can be either positive or negative. And when you make that splash, I'm a firm believer in the ripple effect, that it comes out from you and it influences not only yourself, but it influences all those around you. And again, we all want to make a positive influence and have this positive splash. And this comes back to your mindset. And as leaders, one of the things that's important to know is that it has nothing to do with position or title, because every one of you are leaders. And it starts with leading yourself. And from there, it expands into leading your community, leading those around you, leading your family. As such, it's really important, and I'm going to steal a phrase here from what the Army used to utilize in the recruitment videos all the time. It's important that you be all that you can be. Yet, unfortunately, there's baggage that comes with us that comes from past experiences, whether it's a failure, whether it's a promotion you got passed up for, whether it's a project that you didn't get as an organization, whether it's an embarrassment that you had at work. And all of those things go into influencing how we show up and how we really lead not only ourselves, but on others. And that's really the nut of what I want to talk about today, because all of those things, it's possible to change little at a time as to what your mindset's like and how you show up every day. Again, I'm not going to tell you that every day is just going to go swimmingly, because again, there are some days that are just absolute train wrecks. Yet, the things that I'm going to talk to you about today, and I'm going to present 4 different tools that you could use. You can pick one of them, you can pick all of them, but the most important thing will be to start, and we'll talk about that at the end. And these are based upon conversations that I've had with people that I know display exemplary leadership skills, as well as people that I have worked for. And also it's been influenced by, as I've looked back on my own career, times that, well, let's just put it this way, I sucked. And I'll just be open and honest about that. But it starts, again, because it's a mindset issue, it starts with how you think. Because like ripples, success comes from the inside out. And as you begin to make small changes in how you show up and how you think about yourself, as well as those around you, you can begin to change the world in some pretty fantastic ways. So we're just going to jump into the middle of this, and you're going to hear 4 tools. They all start with the letter L. That's why we do this for the L of it. And the first one we're going to talk about is to laugh more. You're probably aware of this, but your body really is nothing more than a big chemical factory. And when you laugh, there are some physiological things that happen. The chemistry factory kicks into high gear, and you begin to produce endorphins. And if you're familiar with runner's high, then it's the same kind of thing. The primary function of endorphins is to control or to counteract pain signals. But being a morphine-like substance, they also produce a euphoric effect, which is why you end up with runner's high. And it's really just a fancy way of saying that, when you laugh, you feel better about yourself. You just feel good. And in leadership, it's critical. Because one of the things I found in my experience in leading companies and leading people was that you want to be, or you need to be, relatable to the people that you work with. And laughter is such a disarming element that you can utilize, that it really helps make you more relatable as a leader. One of the first guys I ever worked for was a gentleman by the name of George Lostra. And this was probably it's a number of years ago. I won't tell you exactly how many, but it's been a number of years. George was a rather unremarkable guy. He was, probably 5'8", overweight, balding white hair, big fluffy mustache, and you'd look at him and go, yeah, there's nothing special about this guy. But George always seemed to have a smile on his face and show up with some sort of amusing story or amusing anecdote that he could tell. The 5 of us that worked for him, there were 2 gentlemen in particular that over the year that I worked with George, I saw him do some really incredible things with these 2 guys. Tom was he's probably, I don't know, at that point in time, probably 25, 26 years old, single guy, architect. This is back in the day when we did manual drafting. And Tom, I always thought, was a little bit underemployed. and he didn't really relate much as I first started working with George and his group. He really didn't relate much with the rest of us. And then there was James, and James was a guy who had a real tough childhood. He grew up in a really tough neighborhood in Philadelphia, and he was a very bitter man when I first met him. Yet as I watched George use humor to begin to relate more to James, James really opened up with the rest of us as well. And I thought, this is really a fantastic kind of example of what humor can do to break down barriers and make us all more relatable and make it disarming to be around us and be with us. Because I thought, if humor can disarm that kind of bitterness, what else could it do? And it was just a phenomenal piece of experience for me to be able to do this. So in addition to being more relatable, one of the things that humor does is humor makes you more creative. And as you read through the Daring to Lead book, you'll find that one of the tenets and elements that Brene Brown talks about is there's really nothing more disarming or much more what's the right word? Nothing inhibits or tamps down creativity more than judgment. And when you laugh, one of the things that happens to you is you become more vulnerable, because you open up and it works for you. And I had this opportunity to watch, I think this gentleman that I'm going to talk about, a lot of you know, so I'm not going to use his real name. But I have a part of what I do is I work with people who are unfamiliar with each other. So I bring these technical teams together of people who are experts in their field, yet they don't know each other. And you've all experienced this, that when you bring experts in their field together, one of the things that they want to do is they want to show how smart they are. This guy, Charlie, would tell story after story of his experiences. A lot of it was humorous anecdotes. Some of it was self-deprecating humor. But what he did is he got people to loosen up and to laugh. And I not only saw the creativity in Charlie go up as this happened, but what I saw was creativity in the other people as well. They did things and came up with ideas that I never figured they would come up with. But it was all because they were in a safe space. And one of the things that being creative does is it creates a safe space for you to explore different options. And it's super easy to create an environment or a culture where this happens. You know, you can tell jokes, and I was telling Brittany, I said, I've never gone wrong with a good Geico commercial. And so I have one of my all-time favorites. I told Brittany this, I said, there isn't a husband alive who cannot relate to this video. And so here we go.
15 minutes could save you 15% or more on car insurance.
Yep, everybody knows that.
Well, did you know that some owls aren't that wise?
Don't forget I'm having brunch with Megan tomorrow.
Who?
Megan, my coworker.
Who?
Seriously, you've met her like 3 times.
Who?
Geico. 15 minutes could save you. Well, you know.
And that commercial's 8 years old, and I laugh at that every time that I see that. I love that commercial.
That was awesome.
So being a dad, I'm gonna throw a dad joke in every now and then, and I've got one for you here. So, what's blue and doesn't weigh very much?
You got me.
Anybody? Light blue. So feel free. Again, and I've got some resources at the end where you can go find all kinds of different kinds of jokes. But one of the things that humor does is, in addition to making you relatable and creative, is it sets a tone for the rest of your team. And part of laughing more is an opportunity to do that. The third thing that it really does, in addition to making you more relatable, more creative, is it helps you retain information more. Whoops, there we go. So when you laugh, you relax. And when you laugh, you're open to suggestion, or as you relax, you're open to suggestion, and you retain information better. When you hear humor, and there's a reason that speakers try to interject it as much as possible, is it creates what I read was known as a memorable instance of conflict. What that says is, as you hear a joke, your brain has to go through and resolve the conflict. And when you resolve the conflict, it's funny. If you don't resolve the conflict, you're confused. And as you resolve the conflict, your brain becomes open to suggestion. And there's studies have shown that you retain more information immediately after laughing than a lot of other times that during the day. A few years back, I had the opportunity to hear a gentleman by the name of Marty Solomon tell a story. And the story is, you hear it and it's pretty unremarkable, but I'm going to tell a little bit more about it later. But it wasn't, when it comes to retaining information, and this is why I remembered the story, is that what I saw and what I witnessed was Marty laughing about this story. And the humor and the complete joy that he had on his face when he was telling the story was phenomenal. And it was that aspect of this story that you'll hear a little bit more about it later. But it was that element that helped me remember a very unremarkable story. So if you think about that and you say, well, if it helps me retain information, but it not only helps you retain it, it helps you recall information as well. And you not only recall information about what you've heard, but you get to recall information about other things that you've learned as well. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So I have one more dad joke for you that, the other day I suggested to my wife that she embrace her mistakes. And she came over and gave me a big hug.
I'm going to steal that.
Feel free. So the first L is to laugh more. And the second one is to learn more. And you maybe have heard of this, maybe not. But this beat you probably haven't heard of before. A few years back, I was at a board meeting, and there was a psychologist from Houston who came in and gave us an address. And the numbers she tossed out, I don't know how she came up with them, but let's just work with them as being accurate for today's presentation. So she came in and she showed us this picture of you and your brain. And so this is you, and you guys all look really good, by the way. She said, this little blue segment here, this little wedge represents about 5% of the capacity of your brain. And that represents that you know what you know. And again, I don't know how she came up with 5%, but let's just work with that. This little orange wedge here represents that you know what you don't know. And that's about 10% of the capacity of your brain. It's the other 85% that it's what in the learning cycle people would call unconscious incompetence, or you don't know what you don't know. And from a learning perspective, that creates such phenomenal opportunities, in my opinion, because if this capacity of our brain is open, then what could we do with this? In the corporate world, there's a real interesting phenomenon, I think, that connects training and learning, and there's a lot of overlap when it comes to that. That's how I will say it. And the bulk of the training in the corporate world, or learning, in the corporate world, I think, is actually training. And generally, it's to try and shore up what's known as a perceived weakness, or what somebody feels is a perceived weakness. And if it's a perceived weakness, it's probably because you don't have an aptitude for whatever it is that they're trying to train you on. And it's highly unlikely, in my opinion, that additional class time is going to shore up something that you're not particularly good at because you don't have an aptitude for it. In addition to that, how engaged are you when you go to a training that is something that you're not that excited about learning about? when that happens, I think the expectations are way too high. But what if you thought about learning a little bit differently and said, let's look at this from the standpoint of experimenting, exploration, and discovery. And for how many of you have kids? Show of hands. Right. So if you think back, especially when your kids were young, about how your children learned. And they learned by experimenting, and not because you made it, like, for instance, if you think about how they learned to walk, and I'm going to get into a story about that here just a second, but you didn't sit and explain to them how to walk. They figured that out all by themselves through experiment. And I'm coming back to the Marty Solomon story, because that was what he was telling. His story was about a day when he took his daughter to the park. And his daughter was walking at the time, but she'd been walking around on flat surfaces in his living room. And the story says he watched her as she went down this hill, not a particularly steep hill, but it was probably, he said, about 8 or 10 feet high. And the issue was she got down on her own, but it was the navigation of coming back up the hill that was striking to him. He said she took a step, fell down, and laughed. Took a step, fell down, and laughed. And all this time she's processing this whole aspect of how to learn to walk uphill. And eventually, he said about 20, 25 minutes later, she made it all the way to the top and just broke out in sheer laughter because of her accomplishment. What we need to do as adults, I believe, is to learn how to discover things and how to experience and experiment with learning again. This last fall, I decided to take up tennis again after an extended hiatus. And one of the things that I have learned in this process is that everything that I thought I knew before, I need to experience all over again, because the game has changed so much, and the opponents I'm playing today are far better than the ones I played before. And what I knew before, even though it's helpful today, isn't that helpful, because I'm learning all over again. And it's been a really exciting opportunity for me to just go and experience this one more time. And what I would say is that, this is what I would say, that as leaders, again, setting the tone, that you demonstrate the ability to learn, the ability to, you're going to fail as you learn. This is great, because there's no better teacher than failure. That's been my experience. And it's not necessarily the most comfortable teacher, but nonetheless, I think it's one of the best ones. And I think what I would suggest to you is that you find something that you've always wanted to do, but have always made an excuse not to. Or you find a skill that you would like to get better at and sharpen, and go out and experience how to do that. One of the things that researchers have found is through experience and learning things, that there are physiological changes that happen in your brain. And that when you learn things, you have these synapses that fire and synapses that fire together, wire together, and you create this neuroplasticity where you get these new neurons that help in the communication of information. What they're finding is that there are certain kinds of activities, such as learning music or learning a language, a second language, that have significant impacts on the growth of certain parts of your brain. Not physical growth, but what your capacity of the brain actually is. And it's shown to have some positive effects on the cognitive decline that generally happens with age. And my personal opinion is that a lot of that's because of the fact that you get to experience some things. And as you do that, it's again, learning like a child. So my advice to you is to go learn something brand new, and adopt the old Chinese proverb that the best time to I'm going to change this around where well, the Chinese proverb says, best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. So go start something new. The only downside to that is the more you know, the more you realize of what it is that you don't know. So that's just a thing. So that takes us to our third L, which is to listen. I'm going to be willing to bet that if you're like me, you have had experiences where you filled in the end of someone's sentence before they finished it. Or that you formulated a response in a part of a conversation before the person you were conversing with finished their statement. And Stephen Covey, in his book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, one of the tenets in there is to seek first to understand and then to be understood. So now a really significant part of that is to be able to listen well. There's an author, Michael Port, who says that one of the things that active listeners do is they listen with their entire body. So not only are you listening with your ears, but your eyes are doing things. You're paying attention to the different senses that come along. And we're going to play a little bit of a game here, and I do need a volunteer. It's painless, by the way. Nikki, thank you. You get to unmute yourself.
Hi.
Thank you for volunteering. This could be fun. We're going to play a game called Yes and. And how this works is I'm going to ask the rest of the group to come up with a scenario. There's 2 things that you have to come up with. One is a scenario of how Nikki and I know each other. And the second one is a place where Nikki and I are and what we're having a conversation about. And Nikki, how this works is you and I will have this conversation, and we each have to use the words yes and in our response to the statement or question that, for instance, I'll make a statement and you'll respond and say yes and then you'll have to fill in another statement, or you'll have to make a statement. And whether it makes sense or not is of little or no value, or of importance, excuse me. Then as you respond, I'll have to use the words yes and in my response to you. So we just go back and forth. So really it's an opportunity to really listen to what the individual has to say before you formulate your response. So I need to know how it is that Nikki and I know each other.
Could you be her aerobics instructor?
I could be her aerobics instructor. That's a possibility. All right. So Nikki's in one of my aerobics classes. And where is it that Nikki and I are today? And what are we talking about?
You could be in Hawaii, because that sounds fantastic.
Okay. And what are we talking about?
Your love of fur babies.
Fur babies. Okay. There we go. All right. Do you want to go first or second, Nikki?
Second.
Second. Okay. Nikki, one of the things, I know we shared this love of fur babies, and I just have to tell you that one of the best Christmas presents I got was 2 kittens. And I don't know if you've experienced kittens or not, but they bring so much joy to your life. And is that something that you have ever desired to do?
Yes, and I experienced the same joy with a group of puppies that we found on the road behind my grandmother's house.
Wow. And so the experience between puppies, I can see how those 2 are the same, and that yes, what I've experienced is that I've never had 2 puppies. I've had 1, And I've found that one is a handful. I'm just curious how you navigated the two puppies behind your grandmother's house before.
Yes, and two puppies are a handful. Just as two kitties are probably just as much of a handful. We went on lots of long walks to alleviate some puppy nonsense.
Yeah, yes, I can understand how the puppy nonsense happens. And one of the things that I've wanted to do, or I've done with our kittens, is to make them indoor cats. Yet it seems counterintuitive to do this to a kitten. Have you had any experience with that?
Yes, and my roommate in college struggled with the same choices. Her cat at the time really loved being outside, but it was completely too dangerous.
Yes, I've had, you bring up roommates in college, and this is a really interesting thing that I've noticed that, or one of the just to tell you a little bit of an experience that I had, and what I have is I had a friend of mine in high school that had a roommate in college with the same name as me. Have you ever heard of anything like that before?
Yes, and my husband has a last name of Smith. He works at a large company in Charlotte, and there are actually 4 Stacy Smiths at his work.
How does he navigate all of that? And when you think about, who gets to say yes to the which Stacy Smith gets to say yes to this, and which Stacy Smith gets to say yes to that. I can see how that would be confusing and really counterproductive. Has he experienced that before?
Yes, and he has received several emails for his colleague Stacy Smith in HR, which some of them are quite personal in nature, which he returns quickly to say that you had contacted the incorrect Stacy Smith within the firm.
Wow, and I've never experienced that. I've never received an email from someone who had the same name as me, and I would think, well, yes, I could respond to this, and I'm not quite sure how I would do that. And if I did, would it create more of a problem for me? And I don't know I'm curious as to whether your husband has experienced anything of that nature.
Yes, and it's certainly a sticky situation because you certainly don't want to betray the confidence of your colleague, although they're not face to face. Thankfully, most of the initial inquiries were very neutral in tone and didn't involve some details of that person's circumstance.
Yes, do tell and keep it clean. All right, so that's good. So let's give Nikki a hand there.
Whoa, good job, Nikki.
All right, so I'm curious. First, Nikki, what did you think about that?
The strategy that we had lined up with the rapport, with the initial, with the return rapport, really pinpointed my thought process to listen intently to what you were sharing, because I felt that I was in a position of following the script.
Okay.
Or following the train of thought.
Okay. Anything else that you noticed there? That I'm going to open it up to the entire group for input about what you guys noticed there. Let's just open it up to everybody. What did you guys notice there?
It seems like it prolonged the conversation, that each of you had to really pay attention to what the other person was saying so that you could respond appropriately. It kind of reminded me in a way of call and response type of communication method. Yeah.
Okay.
Elaborating
else?
elaborating on the paying attention, because you didn't know what she was going to say, and vice versa. You weren't able
Yes.
to tune it out. You had you had to listen.
Yes. Anything else? Did you see, or did you notice that it was, I will tell you this, it's more challenging to incorporate those two words to a statement than it is to a question. Yet, a lot of our conversations are statements, or are, the conversations are statements back and forth. And yes, it's harder to incorporate that, and it's more rewarding when you're able to do that. So that's just a little trick that you can, play this. You can play this game at parties if you're so inclined, or you can do it you can actually do it in team meetings sometimes, just to get people to, part of what being a leader is, in my opinion, is getting people to really believe what they're capable of. And to do that, sometimes you have to change the tone of the meeting, and change how you look at and how you view things. And doing some different things at the beginning of your meetings is a different way of getting people to, again, to open up, to laugh more, to listen more, and to learn more, and just be more creative. So thanks, Nikki, for playing. Well done. Well done. All right. So that brings me to the fourth L, which is to love. Now, love's something we generally don't talk about in the workplace, which I think is really unfortunate, because when you think about it being an opportunity or an element for change, and how you change yourself and how you change your relationship to the people around you, I think it creates some incredibly powerful situations or opportunities, whatever you want to call them, to do this. And we want to talk about love as a verb, and the one that I'm going to talk about today is the definitions is to show enthusiasm for. And as you think about, as a leader, that you want to not only you're trying to impact and influence the world and those around you. I mean, you're in your sphere of influence. And one of the things that is important is that and this may sound a little weird, but I'm going to throw it out here anyways, that it's super important to love yourself first. There's a tendency that we have to, wish that, I mean, I asked Brittany this question when we had lunch a couple of weeks ago about if you were to start your career all over again, would you do the same thing you did today? And I think we're a little critical of ourselves. We have a tendency to do, our self-talk isn't always the most positive, or isn't as positive as it could be. And if you think about the things that we've learned, the fears that we've had, the rejections that we've had in life, all this baggage that we talked about before we bring with us. And sometimes it's hard to be really enthusiastic about ourselves. Yet the more enthusiastic you can be about yourself, the more enthusiastic you can be about those that you lead, because you now you look like a mirror. And when they see this, it changes your relationship with them. And the question really then becomes, what does it look like to show love in the workplace? And the answer is, it depends. How you receive love, and again, this enthusiasm, if you will, is different than how others are going to receive it. Gary Chapman wrote a book. His most famous work is The 5 Love Languages. He also wrote a book called The 5 Languages of Appreciation in the Workplace. And the 5 languages are the same. They're acts of service, gifts, quality time, words of affirmation, and physical touch. And human beings have a primary and a secondary way of receiving and giving, well, receiving affirmation. I've read some studies that say that affirmation is secondary only to our need for survival. I'm not quite sure how that was arrived at, but it's an interesting piece of information to think about. And as leaders, one of the things that you'll want to do is to figure out how your teammates are affirmed. And how they're affirmed is highly likely going to be different than how you are affirmed. And everybody has a primary and a secondary way of being affirmed in their workplace. And it's important for you as a leader that you're affirmed right along with being with affirming your teammates. Because if your tank isn't full, it's super hard to show enthusiasm for your teammates. And unless you're working with a bunch of zombies, which I'm highly confident that none of you do, there's this reciprocal effect that happens that as you begin to affirm people, they begin to affirm you as well. And the fact that everybody wants your boss to notice you and affirm you but part of being a leader really is again, I'm going to make a statement here, so that I don't think it's important for you to know where it comes from. As long as the affirmation comes and your tank is full, you'll be able to fill up other people. And it's in that filling up of other people and showing that appreciation and affirmation to other people that's really where some magic begins to happen as you begin to work through this as well. And again, it's adopt the old Chinese proverb, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, second best time is today. That as you think about how do you show love and affirm people in the workplace, start today. Do something that's going to be different, because really it's really about being an agent of change. And the tools that we've talked about today are ways that as you begin to incorporate them, that small changes will happen in you, and it's little things that make a big difference. Those smaller changes will have a tendency to grow and grow and grow, and your ability to influence and impact those around you is going to do nothing but grow. So if there are any questions, let's open it up, and then I've got a little bit of one more thing to finish up with.
Well, first of all, fantastic job. Thank you. So 2 for me is, one, difficult personalities, maybe people that aren't so receptive to the laughing and the fun and kind of navigating to meet people where they're at, maybe if they're introverts.
And I think it's a trial and error, I would say. And I think that, and I'll talk about my own experience, and that is, there's a little bit of a feeling out process. I think that everybody is receptive to humor in their own way. And it's like the languages of appreciation, that how you typically express humor in your life and how you essentially receive humor may be wildly different, and is likely wildly different to someone with a really, like in the James case, where he was a very bitter man. And it like I say, it took George the better part of a year to really crack that nut. And he tried different things, and it's going to be my experience is it's a lot of trial and error, that you have to be willing to experiment and just to see what it's like we talked before, it's like throwing spaghetti against the wall. You have to be willing to try some different things and to see what works. And I know that's not because there's never a be all end all, because, the thing, one of the things that I've noticed is that, especially when you hire people, you go through this long or maybe short interview, where you're collecting resumes, you're interviewing people, you're going through a selection process. You go to hire a great professional and a person shows up. And it's the person that you want to relate to, not necessarily the professional, because there's another comment that Michael Port has made, which I 100% agree with, which is, the majority, if not all, of our business problems are personal problems in disguise. And it's the person aspect that you kind of have to figure out how to relate to. But there are very few people in the world that are unreceptive to some kind of humor, but it's just a trial and error, I would say. That's been my experience anyway.
Agreed. But do you have any tips and tactics for kind of authentic, meaningful connection for the people that were still largely remote, and being intentional about making the efforts and kind of what that looks like?
Yeah, I think so I'm going to give you some resources here. I found that if you can start a meeting with something comical, something humorous, whether it doesn't have to be super funny, but when you have the opportunity to begin with a joke, that you can bring people together relatively quickly. That, again, it's because it's so disarming and it sets a tone that a lot of people aren't really expecting, to say, well, if the rest of this meeting is going to be fun like this, then I definitely want to pay attention, and rather than, because I work I shouldn't tell you this, but I'm going to tell you anyway. I work with a lot of people from the Corps of Engineers, and not a lot of the people from the Corps of Engineers in virtual meetings turn their cameras on. And this is not a slight to anybody here who doesn't have a camera on, but the issue is that you don't know what they're doing. I couldn't tell you whether they're marginally engaged or not. And one of the things that I have found is that even doing certain humorous things, at least it elicits a response from them. I would tell you that, but I think I would say you'll never be able to duplicate a connection, an in-person connection, or a connection with an individual the same way virtually as you can in person. I'm just a firm believer of that. Yet there are things that you can do to make it more relatable, let's put it that way. And especially now when so much of what we've done for the last 2.5 years is virtual meetings, and so easy to blow off a virtual meeting unless it's I guess if it's a work thing, not so much, but I've scheduled a number of webinars and virtual sessions that people said, yeah, if I didn't go, that would be okay. But it's just harder now, I think, because of that. And after 2 years of it, I think we're just kind of worn out with it. So doing things that you can, there are meetings that have a humorist, and I think that's a brilliant idea, where someone on your team every week is dedicated or assigned the role of being the humorist. And there are things you can do as far as there's an Energizer bunny who is like in Vistage groups, they always have an Energizer bunny, and that individual is the one who's in charge of doing something that brings energy to the group. So those kinds of things I think work really well.
Love that. Anybody else have any questions, comments? Nikki?
I find it hard to make sure that I'm giving compliments and affirmation, appreciation that's not so much sincere, because I am sincere, but something that's not vague or cliche or a tired kind of language adage.
Mhm.
It's because I am sincere, and I want, and usually I can find a touch point that is relatable to the circumstance.
Mhm.
But sometimes I feel when I'm sharing the affirmation, that I don't want it to appear as tired or forced.
Okay. So let me try something on you then, to say, Nikki, one of the things I appreciated about that was that your honesty in struggling with appearing genuine. That is my impression. I don't know whether that was what you were intending or not, but that's kind of how I phrased that. But you might say something else and it might show up some other way. But if you're affirming a behavior, because that's really what a lot of what we want to do as leaders is to create more of the behaviors that we find beneficial in our team members. And if you use the same word over and over and over again, I bet the person who's hearing that doesn't pay attention to that. Because what they're hearing is, and what they're feeling is, Nikki appreciates what I do. Nikki loves what I do. She finds what I do great. If she uses that word over and over, you could, again, I would say you could ask the people that you're affirming and they would never know that.
So I've overthought it.
Yeah. Which is typically, I think that's a human trait, is that we get into our own heads way too much. And if we just lighten up, and again, I think this is why laughter is such a great thing to do in the workplace, is that when you lighten up and just not take yourself so seriously, the world is a heck of a lot easier for you.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for those thoughts.
Yeah,
those points.
I wouldn't,
Yeah.
again, I wouldn't worry about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're dead on in the fact that I was overthinking my sincerity. And the fact is, I really am sincere.
Yeah. And like I say, like if you were to tell me 3 times in a 1 month period that I did a great job, I wouldn't care what word you used.
Gotcha. Yeah. It's the sincere expression.
Yeah. And again, so think about what I talked before about the majority of, studies show that a lot of our communication is nonverbal. And the fact that you are showing up with a smile on your face, you're showing up and your body language, your facial expressions, and the tone of your voice communicate much more than the words you actually use.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
All right. It's 12:56.
Okay, so I got to wrap up here. So here's my wrap up. Here's my wrap up. So what do you remember most about JFK?
Ask not what you can do.
Okay. I think that's what most people would say. Yeah, so it was what, 51 plus years ago. He gave a speech to Congress where he said, by the end of this decade, we will put a man on the moon and put men on the moon and bring them back safely. And if you think about that, the changes in the world that have come from such a bold statement are incredible. And yet, while that is a bold statement, there are small statements that everyone can make, everyone can do, small things that everyone can do, because our circle of influence is a lot smaller than the President of the United States would be. And yet it's when we have this change, this opportunity to change the world around us, small w, fantastic things can happen. So I'm going to offer a couple of things up to you. First, I'm going to challenge you. And my challenge to you is to do this, that pick one of the 4 things that we talked about. You could pick more, but pick at least one and come up with a strategy for how you're going to implement that over the next, just say 3 months. And I'm going to give you my contact information in a minute. And I would love it if you would email me what you're going to do. That way I can follow up with you and have this dialogue. And it's a great opportunity to ask questions and see how this whole thing works. For anyone who's interested, wait a minute, that's not supposed to show up. All right. So if you're interested in a 30-minute consultation, no charge, I'm happy to do that. You can scan this QR code. And these are also in the handout that you got, so you can scan them from there as well. Then again, contact me via email. I want to know what it is that you plan on doing to begin to change yourself and change the world around you, to be a more extreme leader.
Beautiful. And yeah, Randy has a ton of nuggets and recommendations and books and people that inspire him. So if you want more resources from him, he's more than happy to share. And
yep,
thanks for holding us accountable. All right. Well, thanks again for your time, Randy.
So I'm going to stop sharing here.
Yes, perfect.
There we go.
And with that, thank you guys. And next week we got Jess Hickey back, and hopefully more time with you, Randy, in the future.
Love to do that. Thank you.
We would love it. All right, guys. Have a good day. Bye.
Great. Thanks, everyone.